I want you to imagine that we are at the first story ever told. Maybe we're with the ancient people gathered around a fire and someone stands up and they start talking and there's something magical about it. You know, there's a cadence, there's a rhythm. And as we sit there listening to this man talk, we're beginning to empathize with people we've never empathized with before. And we're able to see ourselves in the characters that are being spoken about. And we're able to reflect deeply and realize something about ourselves. The whole thing is mystic. The whole thing is magical. The whole thing is transcendent. And then someone puts up their hand and they say, but does this count as reading? Right, what a stupid way to begin my video. But there's some truth to it, you know, like you go on BookTube and you'll see this question everywhere. Do audiobooks count as reading? So my mate Thomas Howell, for example, he made a video on his perspective on audiobooks and why he doesn't tend to gravitate towards them as much. I had a live stream with a few mates last week, and one of them was Chris from the first chapter with Chris, and he kind of laid out his position on why he also feels that audiobooks are not for him. And although I haven't addressed this question directly, I've also sort of implicitly handled it, in as much as I've made a couple of videos on audiobooks and video games in the past, and I'm planning to make another video soon about the books that are best to audiobook to, especially alongside a video game. So yeah, this question's everywhere. You can't really get away from it. And even when people just say on BookTube things like, yeah, I read that book, I audiobooked it, you often find someone in the comments going, but, And to be honest, like a classic fence sitter, I can kind of see both sides of the argument, right? I do enjoy audiobooks a lot. I would say maybe 50% of my reading is done via audiobook. Right now I'm doing Mushroom Blues by Adrian Gibson, having a great time with it. I'm doing that by audiobook. It's easier for me to read it that way with time being so pressed. And the narrator's fabulous. The narrator's doing a great job with that. So I forget the name of the narrator, but I'll put it down below. So some of the arguments for audiobooks sort of fall under the umbrella of what does this word read mean, right? We don't really mean, by the word read and by reading, we don't really mean physically eyes staring on the page and looking at each of these words in sequence. What we kind of tend to mean these days is just that we have consumed the text. So whether that's on the page or whether that's through a different medium such as audiobook, it still counts. Whether it's an audio drama or a singular person putting on this performance or even AI, you know, doing text-to-speech generation, the words are still getting in there. And that is kind of what we mean by read in today's day and age. But then some of the arguments against stuff like, well, the cognitive thing is the big one, that we tend to believe that reading and looking at stuff on the page equates to more kind of cognitive brain power being used, which equates to a more worthwhile time, right? People will say, well, when you're reading, you're paying attention. It's almost like studying. And when you're using the audiobook, it's not the same. You're passively letting the words float into you. Don't know if anyone's ever said it quite like that, but that's kind of the intimation. The result is that these people say your analysis might be a bit poorer, you didn't pick up on as much as someone who was physically reading the text, and also there's kind of a slippery slope element to it. You know, if audiobooks count as reading, does that mean that going to a Shakespeare play, and I saw this in a real comment last week, does that mean that going to a Shakespeare play and watching Macbeth being performed, does that mean that you've read Macbeth? Surely not. And you also have that kind of softer anti-audiobook argument, that kind of thing where people say, listen, audiobooks are fine, I'm glad they exist, they're just not for me. Me personally, I will read a chapter and I'll realize I've missed a few paragraphs, I've missed a few pages, and it's better for me to have that book in front of me. That's what Chris said, that's what Thomas said. I hope you guys don't mind me paraphrasing you, but that seemed to me to be the brunt of it. And then Thomas also said in his video, you know, I prefer the reading experience. For me, having that quiet time with a book is really important, and I can't really have that when it's someone non-stop narrating in my ears. But there's something that worries me here. Have you noticed? It's always the same question over and over again. The sentence never really changes. The words never really change. The syntax never really changes. Do audiobooks count as reading? It's those 5 words over and over again. And I think we're very good at zooming into the word audiobooks and discussing what it means to audiobook something. And I think we're doing a great job talking about that word read and understanding that word read and reading and what does that mean to read something. We discussed that till the cows come home. But I think there's a word in that sentence that's sneaking under the surface, that's kind of pervading the discussion that we don't talk about as much. And that word is count. What do we mean by count? We keep saying, do audiobooks count as reading? And that word count just sort of slides in there, and we allow it to. What does count mean? What does count mean in this context? It makes me think of like Legolas and Gimli, you know, that still only counts as one. That's kind of what's going on here. And of course, when you stop and think about it, we all know what count means. Count implies some kind of competition. It implies some kind of score. Within this whole conversation and question, there's a sneaky presupposition that we're all doing it for our reading points card. We're all doing it for our ongoing tally. The question behind the question is always, how can we get our literary number up? And listen, we all fall to let's call it the literary stamp card. We all fall to it in various ways, right? We've got the Goodreads challenges. Can you read 100 books a year? We've got the monthly wrap-ups even on BookTube channels, which I do too. There's nothing wrong with these. They're kind of fun in like a reflective way. It allows us to step back, look at our reading over the course of a month or a year, or even more holistically, like previous years altogether, and see where we've come from, where we're going, and what those general trends are. There's nothing wrong with that whatsoever. But the problem is, and this is the issue with the word count, is that these challenges are supposed to be just for ourselves. And if we're not careful, we sort of use them as a measuring stick with which we measure one another. When we start to count the notches on the number of books we've read, and we're not doing that for ourselves as a way of just kind of, in a fun manner, measuring our own progress or lack thereof, and we start to use that as a means of competition, and then we start to insert all these rules within that competition. Do audiobooks count? Do rereads count? Does a 200-page novella count as much as in a 1,000-page behemoth? That's when it all starts to fall apart. Suddenly you're up to your knees in this implicit competition, this race that no one signed up for, but we all seem to be kind of walking and sort of looking at each other like this. It's kind of bizarre, but it's so hard to not do, right? Especially if you're someone who counts yourself as a reader, because reading is part of our identity. It just is. And that's not a bad thing either. I am a reader. It's something I identify as. But if the thing we are making part of our identity is also something that can grow or diminish as we stand next to other people who have that same identity, that's a problem. If our sense of self is skewed by the reader next to us, that's a problem. It sort of becomes a bit perverse. It definitely robs us of some of the joy of the thing that we got into for fun in the first place. And you know what, you see this in other arenas too. It's not just reading. Like, I used to travel a lot in my 20s, and whenever you'd roll up into a travel hostel, the same questions would always get asked. How many months? And it's always months. How many months are you traveling? How many countries have you been to? And again, that sort of implicit sense of competition is just teetering, simmering under the surface, and can get really destructive if not kept in check. So what's my conclusion here? Well, I would just tell you that audiobooks count as reading. And I kind of want to take that word count away. Audiobooks are reading. And that's not because they're the same as physical reading, but what I want to do is I want to broaden and encourage reading as much as possible, right? So for me, anything remotely connected to reading counts. Manga, picture books, audiobooks. If the main activity is the consumption of text, that's fine. That is reading. And I don't want to take that away from anyone. I love reading these 1,000-page novels. I love reading these 1,200-page novels. I love reading these 10,000-page series. But my enjoyment of those 10,000-page series should not come at the expense of someone who's reading a 200-page book, or listening to an audiobook, or reading a graphic novel. My sense of accomplishment in doing that should not cheapen this. Now, I'm sure that you could reduce this to absurdity very quickly. You could say, do pamphlets count as reading? Do billboards count as reading? Does reading the label on the back of your clothes count as reading? My concern is anti-gatekeeping, especially as a teacher, right? For me, I want to explode what counts as reading so we can get as many people into this hobby as possible. In a day and age where it feels like fewer and fewer and fewer people are looking at words, why should we limit those who are? If you spot a friend who's maybe reading the same thing over and over, of course you can say, hey, why don't you try this? But ultimately, I think it's better for everyone to feel the joy of reading in whatever capacity they want to, rather than trying to take their scorecard away. So that's it for today. It's just a quick short video. Let me know what you think. Let me know if you share my opinion. Let me know if you vehemently disagree. That's all fine. And in the meantime, it's getting very noisy. I'll see you on the next one. Bye.